the birth of the IT sector that happened in the world, it is because of the plowing back of petrodollars into the US economy. So then all of their dot-com bubbles started to completely accumulate during the late 90s. After that, the very first serious attempt at de-dollarization was actually started by their own allies, which is Europe. So Europe went and brought the euro currency, and Europe came to know that a great deal of mischief was going on. Yes, only the US dollar is enriching itself, while our own currency is not getting any benefit at all. So Europe brought forward a European Union, which then launched the euro currency somewhere around 1999, right? Now the US, you see, it started panicking. So what they started doing was that, yes, we will print, but these savings that are supposed to come from outside, which the Eurozone used to park, for example, if Germany wants to do some trade with France, then they started doing it in euros, completely putting the dollar aside. Right. So now what is to be done with all this excess dollar? So all of that went and started accumulating inside their dot-com bubble. And on top of that, there are other sectors, because they had already started a great deal of rapprochement with China. So all of the manufacturing jobs, every single one, they went over into the Chinese economy. So now the problem they started having was that their other sectors began to get weak. So they started yet another mischief. With this, they brought forward what is called the Graham-Bliley Act. The Graham-Bliley Act came into the US economy and it repealed the Stegall Act. Now, what the Stegall Act is, that is something we need to understand. The Stegall Act, which was in the US economy, it used to keep investment banking and commercial banking completely separate. The same bank, you see, will take deposits from the people. And the bank that does the investing had to be kept as a separate entity. This was a requirement of the Stegall Act. Okay. So what this Graham-Bliley Act is that there is money lying in some American's account. Okay. And commercial banking and investment banking have both been mixed together. Now the bank that is collecting deposits can also invest. It can do so in the speculation market, right? So now what happened is that as soon as the public deposits money into an account, it gets swept over and comes into the bank's account. And that money is then invested by the bank in speculative businesses. So they played a trick right when the euro currency launched. The very first mischief they did was that they dragged their NATO military alliance right into the Yugoslavia conflict and brought down the value of the euro. And the second mischief they did was by bringing the Graham-Bliley Act, taking the public's deposit money. That money was mixed with the reserve currency bubble and then invested in order to push all of the sectors. The very first de-dollarization attempt that the euro currency made was done in revenge for that. And China also promised them that for whatever trade we do, instead of Europe, we will put our own savings into the US Treasury. You make us a manufacturing giant. This happened in retaliation. So revenge against the euro currency was taken in this manner because they had refused to park their funds. But by that time, you see, the European countries had already refused to park their savings. So their entire IT sector balloon completely burst, which is what we now call the dot-com bubble. In October of 2002, the total valuation of the entire IT sector crashed by a massive 78%. This was because that entire reserve currency bubble had accumulated. And then by bringing in the Graham-Bliley Act, the public's money was also mixed in with the reserve currency bubble to inflate the IT sector. And that entire bubble burst, as a direct result of which we can say that the dot-com burst actually happened because of this first wave of de-dollarization. We must understand that as soon as a crisis hits them, any crisis like the one in 2008, they have only one solution: print more dollars. Only one solution, and Ben Bernanke got a Nobel Prize for doing this activity of, for destroying the economy. He even got a Nobel for it. So when they went to solve the 2008 crisis, and you should mind you, not one single person has gone to jail for the 2008 crisis. Okay, so this is the exact same mischief of the act that I told you about, the Graham-Bliley. the very act that was brought in right after the euro currency, and then in 2008 when this whole crisis started, and this subprime crisis as we call it. So what did the depositors actually get in their hands? Do you know? They call it bail-in. The depositors were simply given a stake in the bank. Not a single person from the bank went to jail, right? Because the entire process was made legal. You yourself stated that you can invest public deposit money in speculative trades wherever you want to. So when these financial biggies started to fall because of the subprime crisis, not a single person went to jail because it was now all legal. But we have to really see what the public was left with. They were given a stake in that entity. They never got their actual money back. Okay, just look at the kind of mischief they have done internally just to keep the reserve currency status of the fiat dollar going. Okay, the public was given a kind of addiction to socialist benefits. For example, they were given Medicare. They gave them income security, 401k retirement funds, and the COVID checks distributed over the last 3 years. Okay, they printed well over 14 trillion and distributed all these freebies among Americans, telling them to go purchase whatever they want. Okay, and in contrast to this, we need to understand why the de-dollarization process started. Where did the de-dollarization process start from? In order to solve the 2008 crisis, they simply went and printed money again. But what happened this time around? During the 2008 crisis, because of all the dollars that were printed, the entire resulting inflation was then passed on to the rest of the world because everyone is forced to trade in US dollars, right? So this inflation that was passed on, particularly in the wake of the resulting food inflation, in the Gulf region, in the Middle East, the Arab Spring protests began to start, and then one after another, all the governments started to fall. It was then that the Middle East finally understood what a truly terrible loss had occurred by continuing to keep the dollar as the reserve currency. Until that point, they only understood that their neighbor was the bad guy, and that to sanction him, well, we have to continue with the dollar. Now, the countries in the Middle East started to realize that this was, in fact, our own. More than 50% of the wealth from our crude oil, we had completely wasted it in radicalization just for the sake of keeping the dollar going. So during the 2011 Arab Spring, the Gulf finally learned this lesson about how big of a financial loss they were actually having to bear, all just to keep the dollar going. Okay? After that, in 2014, a very significant revolution took place, something that you and I and all of us are well aware of. An entirely new kind of nationalist government was set up in India, one which is aiming to revitalize the very core principles, the base of Sanatan economics. A government which understands that Western fiat currencies have accumulated such a massive amount of debt, and because of this, they will not only collapse, but will also take others down with them, all those who are dependent on their payments. This affects all those who export their goods and all those who in the outsourcing verticals are waiting for payments in fiat currency. Okay. So to improvise on this situation, our Narendra Modi government, they were the very first to start taking the lead on this. And this is detailed in my book that is launching this month. It lays out what the entire timeline is. So the very first thing was the demonetization that Modi ji did for the Indian public. But even before that, he had already started the demonetization of the West. And for that, the process is exactly the same one I explained before. You must first accumulate gold by the central banks. And so Modi ji came out with the gold monetization scheme. So the very first thing he tried was to channelize the gold that the Indian public already has. So in 2015, this scheme was not very successful, and that is because of the civilizational wisdom of accumulating gold. It is hard for the Indian public to part with it. Okay. The Indian civilization believes that this is your, it is your last resort, your emergency fund. So the public is not going to part with their gold that easily, right? So Modi ji then began to see that now we will have to start collecting gold from the West if we want to de-dollarize. It is exactly the same way the US started collecting gold from the European Union to remove the pound and to make the dollar the reserve currency. For that purpose, Russia, India, China, and the central banks of some Gulf countries all gradually began to accumulate gold. After that, in 2018, Modi ji made the first offer to China, suggesting that we trade in our national currencies. This was absolutely essential. This is because China is the main export oriented economy. If China does not agree to de-dollarization, then the process cannot move forward at all because they are the world supplier. They are also the manufacturing factory. So in 2018, you will learn that the Chinese Communist Party, which I personally call a US deep state branch sitting in Beijing, but in 2018, Xi Jinping did not have as much control as he does today. So back then, China flatly refused. But the UAE, Iran, and Russia, these three nations gave very positive signals that we are ready for national currency trade because Russia and Iran were already under sanctions. And the UAE was a country that understood the wisdom that the entire Gulf region is kept in a state of conflict just to keep the dollar going. So India's leadership in the de-dollarization process started from there. India went on to reject one multilateral trade format after another. We will not engage in multilateral trade pacts. If you want to trade with us, come to us individually. We will sign a free trade agreement with each one. And the wisdom behind this is that in a multilateral trade format, the unipolar dollar becomes the default because with 10 to 15 countries in that trade pact, you simply cannot convince everyone at once. So India took the lead in de-dollarization, not Russia and China. India took this leadership, and if you look at the archives, you'll see we rejected all multilateral trade pacts. First, we rejected the RCEP. The RCEP with the Southeast Asian countries, China, Japan, and Australia, also started pressuring us to please join. But India clearly refused. We do not want to get into a multilateral trade pact. We'll see later. So one by one, after rejecting all of these multilateral trade pacts, we went forward with bilateral free trade agreements in which we have been very successful. In the next step, Modi ji started UPI, RuPay, and the RuPay card. He started to spread its use, which has now become accepted in 30 countries as a means of payment. Right? The collection of gold and silver is ongoing. UPI, RuPay cards have spread everywhere, and by stopping the multilateral trade pacts, bilateral free trade agreements have been signed. All these processes are moving us in the direction where as soon as the new BRICS currency format arrives, we will say either trade in BRICS currency or in INR. You can convince countries individually because these are individual free trade agreements. All these international bodies, as I explained in the story at the beginning, were created for unipolar dollar-based international trade. They were not made for globalization. So as soon as our term for the presidency at the United Nations Security Council ended in December, and we were not given the high table seat that we deserved, India immediately convened the Global South Summit. And in that, if you watch Modi ji's speech, he very clearly mentioned the Bretton Woods Agreement by name. Very clearly that reforms are needed in the Bretton Woods Agreement, and reforms are also needed in the United Nations.
India's philosophy has always seen the world as one family. However, developing countries desire a globalization that does not create a climate crisis or a debt crisis. We want a globalization that does not lead to an unequal distribution of vaccines or over concentrated global supply chains, which is not what we want. We want a globalization that brings prosperity to all and well being to humanity as a whole. In short, we want a human centric globalization. Excellencies, we developing countries are also quite concerned about the increasing fragmentation of the entire international landscape. These geopolitical tensions distract us from focusing on our development priorities. They cause very sharp swings in the international prices of food, fuel, fertilizer, and many other commodities. To address this geopolitical fragmentation, we urgently need a fundamental reform of the major international organizations, including the United Nations Security Council and the Bretton Woods institution. These reforms would focus on giving voice to the concerns
of the developing world and reflect the realities of the 21st century. So basically, taking the leadership of the entire global south, India is telling them either you reform or you die. This is the strong message which is sent to them. So either these bodies will reform or their relevance will be completely gone. SCO and BRICS will slowly start snatching away their entire relevance. There is a currency that is being printed out of thin air without any base. So there was no interest rate in that economy. Everyone is getting loans at a very low rate and everyone is taking them. Projects are not being delivered. There is no profitability, yet values are increasing because the rest of the world is parking its savings in that economy. Okay, so this whole reserve currency bubble, and when the 2008 crisis happened, this mischief of fiat currency that has been going on for 50 years, there has been so much financialization within it that now when this fiat currency comes to an end, it is going to be very painful for Americans and Western countries. And let me explain why this is going to happen. Because they have created so much financialization and debt-based credit, today their debt of 31 trillion has accumulated. So when the Dutch used to be a world power, when Britain used to be a world power, when the Spanish and the Ottoman empires were world powers, the end of their cycle of being a world power came at the point when the interest payments on their debts finally passed and crossed the level of their total defense spending. So today, America has reached that exact position where the debt servicing for this entire $31 trillion debt mountain that has now been built up, for which they just kept printing and printing and printing for 50 years. Now their debt servicing cost has actually grown larger than their defense spending. Meaning, just like the last 4 world powers that ended up losing their status, America has now reached that very same position.